Good morning and welcome to another session of the novel Letting Go. And as always, please do subscribe to the channel, that helps. And it's now subchapter 2 of chapter 3, Challenges for Anika. Anika was familiar with Bruno's professional and responsible way of taking care of details and attending to people's needs, going beyond his means, sometimes to his exhaustion. Students, not just his own doctoral students, knew that they could always reach him. Not only did they have his private email, he had also given many of them his cell phone number, which, as far as Anika was aware, they used surprisingly rarely. Bruno was a passionate teacher. He was dynamic, had an ear for them, and yet was also productive in his research, published and made the faculty considerably more student-friendly during his time as dean. Surprisingly, despite initial resistance, he had also won over the majority of his colleagues and built up a good relationship with the local bishop. The latter was particularly pleased that the faculty had found greater cohesion after years of tension between conservatives and progressives. Complaints which had previously reached him regularly had decreased drastically, and the reputation of the faculty had reached the bishops' conference, even as far as the Vatican in Rome. Although Rome had taken offense at some of Professor Rechtenwald's ethical theses, particularly with regard to controversial issues such as abortion, celibacy, and the ordination of women, these were forgiven after discussions between the professor and his local bishop, in which differing opinions came to light, but the bishop had gained the impression that he had a man at the forefront in this professor of ethics. In writings and public panel discussions, he had tackled the issues of the day, and due to the increasingly unclear direction of the world church, had presented a position to the press, politicians, and students in which he often declared himself to be in disagreement with the church, but these were positions that the bishop himself could not publicly defend, but secretly did not think were so wrong. In one of these conversations, Bruno's private life was addressed. There had been letters of complaint in which it was claimed that he had been too close to female students, which echoed earlier complaints from the community, that he even lived with a former student, that they appeared together in public, attended theater, dance events, the Oktoberfest in Munich, and swimming pools. She was also now working at the university like him, it was said, so would be in the same professional environment as Bruno. But the bishop was not worried in this respect either. He had invited Bruno for an interview, and when asked whether Bruno wanted to marry this woman, Bruno emphatically denied that she was not one of his former students. In order to get a clearer picture, the bishop had also received Anika in his palace and gained the impression from her that they had a platonic or quasi-platonic relationship, supported in his life and also in the profession, but that she posed no danger of violating church law. She had conceded closeness and openness, but the bishop had nobly withheld further questioning details. Why should he pursue accusations as long as his employees, or at least those who are under his wings, acted within the bounds of church law and no one was harmed? Anika would have continued to answer his questions, especially as she herself neither belonged to the Catholic Church nor had any other inner relationship to organized religion. Questions of morale and political life did concern her, and she sometimes had to deal with them as part of her research and teaching, but the older man who sat opposite her on the couch in his study, smoking one thick cigar after another, rather aroused her regret with his uncertainty and nervousness. Anika was dressed as usual and had previously told him about her work in Kenya, her work with the students, the Art History Museum projects, and research into hybrid gender concepts in contemporary art, particularly using examples of depictions of the Virgin Mary in Latin America, but also Poland and other former Catholic countries. The bishop seemed full of admiration, came to life for the first time, so that he almost forgot his cigar, had to relight it, and asked about her work. He had encountered such contemporary art in public spaces on his own mission trips, even if he could no longer remember the names of the artists. He then talked about an invitation he had received when he had consecrated a church in the UK. In it, an English artist who had lived for years in an ashram near Madras had created a way of the cross that combined Hindi motifs with Christian elements to create uniquely intercultural meditation stations. Instead of addressing the personal sphere, they agreed on the seriousness of the confrontation between religion, art, creation, and its communication to the younger generations. The bishop gave the impression that he was becoming more and more relaxed and satisfied as the conversation progressed. You know, he had replied to Anika in conclusion, canon law is generous. It demands celibacy, even if this is a recent innovation in relation to the age of the church and only began to gain acceptance in the Middle Ages. Many of my clergy live with a woman in the household. Yes, we support this way of life to the best of our ability, because unlike in the past, where a housekeeper, often the mother or relative of the clergyman, was the norm, today I have to deal with a problem that more and more clergy are living and working completely alone in their ever larger communities, which leads to a major problem and, for example, loneliness, alcoholism, and others. Yes, it seems to me, he said rather sheepishly and a little ironically, in a society like ours, where the number of single parents and single households is increasing dramatically, hardly anyone seems to want to get married anymore, with the exception of Catholic clergymen. Anika nodded with a smile. She had understood that the bishop was in the mood for a joke. He seemed to have thawed out. On the other hand, her counterpart fell back into his chair, seemed to groan under the weight of his office, and finally fell silent. Deep wrinkles dug into his face and made it clear how much pressure he was under. Quietly, almost apologetically, he began to talk about the press and the increasingly loud complaints about sexual violence in church institutions. I wonder who the victims are nowadays. It is already assumed that you're a sex offender if you wear clerical garb, but there are black sheep in every society. Yes, Anika said, but isn't the problem exacerbated by the fact that, at least for many years, the church did not reflect on and talk about such problems, protected the perpetrators, and exposed the victims to them? Yes, but I can't know everything and anything, the bishop said. You know, if you've got a position like mine, you could get the impression that the devil has corrupted the whole world. What is good, the clergy and religious who find favor, the message that is lived, and the associations and institutions that function. As a bishop, I hear nothing about any of that. Even the ordinary problems that can be solved only reach my diocesan offices. What is then brought to me are only the most difficult, perhaps even unsolvable problems. Take your chair and sit in it. If it's my chair, I tell you, it's so hard to get up in the morning. It's like going from a comforter to a bed of nails. With his last sentence, the bishop shuddered to himself. Anika had made him open up in a way he would never have dared to do himself. She had recognized the horror in his gaze and in his backward movement, and was not at all prepared to sit opposite a person who would speak so openly about his innermost thoughts. "You see," he added in a softer voice, "I am happy and grateful for every case where I can see no circumstances worthy of punishment." Without saying much, perhaps more through her open manner, Anika had been able to convince him of her life plan, which she was trying to live with Bruno. She had a doctorate, had since completed her habilitation in art history and media at the university, had held a professorship in Cologne before returning to the University of Munich, was self-confident, and, as she convincingly explained to the bishop, was neither interested in getting married nor starting a family. During her studies, she was keen to develop her career as independently as possible. The bishop was most interested when she talked about her various activities, research trips, and projects at home and abroad, her presentations, conferences, and successes at congresses. He was impressed by her courage and demeanor, something he would have liked to see in many of his employees and confreres, whereas he too often experiences the opposite. Instead of being open-minded and courageous, which in his view should have been the result of the life's choices, he too often experienced insensitivity, subservience, fearfulness, and self-pity. Anika thought to herself, self-pity? Her counterpart seemed to share this with his employees. He fit in with the chaplains and priests who told him about being overworked, sleepless, and unable to get their lives and work together. "Many don't even get past their email in the morning," the bishop said, "past the piles of morning mail." The whining about the whiners increasingly upset Anika. As she squeezed his hand in farewell, feeling his ring, while the bishop looked at her with a relief as he accepted her firm grip, while he inwardly fought against the comfort of her hand in his. As soon as Anika stepped into the free space in front of the Episcopal Ordinariat, she looked for the nearest coffee shop and, in that bar, ordered a Sex on the Beach cocktail. How twisted can you look at this world, she thought. Like locking yourself in a cage and developing the feeling that the world around you is trapped. She shook herself violently as she reviewed the encounter. She emerged as if she had traveled back into time, into the Middle Ages. It was inexplicable to her why Bruno had voluntarily placed himself into such a corset, and images from her own Christian and corrupt family came back to her. She herself had experienced constraints and repression at close quarters. It doesn't even take a church institution to make you move through this world in a twisted way. It's enough to be thrown into this world as normal, but what is that? Exposed to parents and siblings who you think are normal, usual, because they're also familiar, until you slowly come to yourself and discover what is abnormal, unusual, unfamiliar, and unreasonable in your closest surroundings, and that in all disagreement with yourself. She had felt the sting at some point and realized that what she had taken for granted as a child was strange, even abhorrent. When her innermost being rebelled and she began to fight for herself. Since then, she had been suspicious of men, especially men who wanted to penetrate her. She wanted to exclude her father from all of this, even if he could have stood up for her. But he wasn't the most sensitive man and didn't stand up. Nevertheless, she thought the world of him. He took care of the family, was righteous and upright as best as he could. Perhaps it was the biggest blow of her life, that she was brought to it by the press and then had to find out from her own research on the internet what was undeniably her own father's story. The worst thing about it was that her father had died shortly before, and she had not been able to question him, or as she would have preferred to say, she had not been able to confront him. She was not only puzzled by the questions of how this grandfatherly father, who had seemed inconspicuous to the outside world and to her on the inside for years and decades, dedicated himself to his pupils, supported his family, and was involved in all kinds of issues in the town, was made an honorary citizen and abstained from any political activity. How her own father had been able to bury a story inside himself that none of the family members knew, or at least not even her mother had ever said a word about. However, the internet made it unmistakably public, and she was soon approached on the street by neighbors, former friends, and soon even by members of her faculty and even students. Her ignorance, which was interpreted as blindness, was even stranger to these people than it was to her. She could not explain herself because she had no explanation, would receive no explanation, because he had remained silent and would never speak again. An American researcher had unearthed documents that had surfaced in Russian archives after the fall of communism, which reported on the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, and its cultural theft policy actions during the Second World War, in which her father undeniably was involved. Anika was doubly struck by this information because she had no idea that she was sitting on a powder keg whose fuse she was lightening with her research. Like her American colleague, she was investigating the so-called Third Reich, uncovering how deeply the brown networks had spread underground into the everyday lives of people in Germany, and from there internationally across the countries. Now, she also had to come to terms with the fact that she herself had been caught up in this swamp right down to her own genes through her family. She spent hours studying the documents that her colleague from the US had drawn her attention to. According to these studies, the ERR had systematically taken libraries, archives, book and art collections, especially from Jewish and Masonic institutions, families and people, robbed them, sorted them, sold duplicates, and delivered the rest to Germany, including personally to Göring and Hitler. She could hardly believe her eyes when she read that her own father had played a central role in the organization of this theft and the associated Nazi robbery, not just by chance, but for a long time, and as the result of a career path that had been laid out for years. Alfred Rosenberg, the man who had adorned his magnum opus with a quote from Meister Eckhart, acted as the head of this plundering police. The center of the action was initially, as she read, the Silesian Research Center in Ratibor, where confiscated books and works of art, reports speak of hundreds of thousands, were viewed, appraised, brought to spectacular public burnings, or sorted out for the personal interest of functionaries. Her reading also revealed the perversity of a totalitarian system in which everyone was their own neighbor and every neighbor was the greatest possible enemy of the other. The railroad wagons that the ERR needed to transport objects of cultural plunder on a large scale from town to town and finally to Ratibor, and from there to the spied-out destinations, had to be taken away from the state organs engaged in the anti-Semitic and anti-communist struggle. The military command required transportation facilities. The army archives needed them to organize communication between the front and war planning and to document everything meticulously. The Reich archives felt disadvantaged. Wounded soldiers had to be removed from the front. They could not be transported together with tapestries, manuscripts, first editions, and oil paintings, which would contaminate them. Here, the battle for species purity and blood separation prevailed even in the most dilapidated wagons. Anika couldn't stop reading. The carcinogenic nocturnal plant had already taken root in January 1934, shortly after the Nazis had taken power. Rosenberg became the head of the spiritual and ideological leadership of the NSDAP and established his bureaucratic empire by creating special units for art, music, and other cultural areas. Finally, after the start of the war in the West, he set up a special task force in France to organize the theft of culture in the occupied territories, especially as the Führer had ordered the confiscation of the larger Jewish art collections. It struck Anika as bitterly cynical that the organization was based in the Grand Orient Lodge of the Freemasons in Paris, of all places. From there, Masonic lodges, Jewish associations and organizations, and private homes were searched for valuable art and cultural objects. And who was in charge of this Paris office of the organization? Joseph Maschka, head of the main working group HAG, her dad. She could barely hold herself up, as if the ground was being pulled out from her and under her feet. She seemed to be sinking into a bottomless pit. Would she ever be able to look at the picture of her recently deceased mother? Would she have denied knowing anything, just as her father had probably erased all memory from his mind? Or was his occasional depressive attitude linked to this form of amnesia? In any case, Dad had not only done thorough work for the Nazis, he had himself been a central point for the murderous brood and had neatly covered his own tracks after the downfall of the Nazis and with them Germany. At least he died quietly in this belief. The victims, as so often, were others. As Anika investigated further, she was traumatized by the fact that she had to accept that her father had not ended up on this path through accidental seduction or some external forces, not through financial problems or mental weakness or even addiction. It was much more complex, and she had to face this truth. Obviously, his decision to write his doctoral thesis in Göttingen already had to do with his desire to help build the future National Socialist Reich. His doctoral supervisor was Friedrich Naumann, who had soon become a member of the SS, and her father had joined the SA, had become a member of the National Socialist Teacher Association, and had already joined the NSDAP in 1937. So it was not the fact that he was drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940 that got him on the National Socialist bandwagon, but he had already decided beforehand not to pursue a career as a teacher after his doctorate or to go into academia, but had tried to look for his future within the party ranks. The contacts he had made in the party must also have been the deciding factor in her father being hired by the ERR as a research assistant in 1941. So he became head of Department for Special Use. And Anika realized that this meant he was not only the head of the ERR main working group with the West area of operations, but that as a Stabseinsatzführer, he was responsible for planning and carrying out the most atrocious acts imaginable against human beings. Deportation, the death to the death camps, robbing these people of their most personal possessions, their valuables, family memories, books, paintings, their art, and their music. His task, as she gathered from the documents, was to sift through, evaluate, and select looted Jewish, Masonic, Ukrainian, Russian, and later French and Belgian collections and libraries. The party idea was to create a huge central library for a super university of the NSDAP, the high school, in order to possess the ideological material to fight against the authors, the greatest of the tradition of present and past of the people they tried to exterminate. Dad's task was therefore the most radical of all destruction. Women, men, children, elderly people not only had their hair cut, the gold pulled out of their teeth. Dad had robbed them of the most valuable thing that these people had created, brought together, and preserved over centuries, which was their tradition. He had snatched their tradition from them and used it against these people, against their history, against their future for which they died in order for him to erase even their memory. What idiocy, what nonsense is life, she thought. A brother who abuses you, a dad who is the spawn of evil, a mother who had remained silent as the grave and could no longer be questioned, two other brothers she no longer knew what to make of, and a partner who had come involved with an institution that perpetuated a totalitarian system in the fight against women. She didn't even have the strength for tears, just a pain-racked face. And these, it seemed to her, were all self-made abysses. In her mind's eye, Feeny appeared, fighting for her life with all her might, giving herself up for her own family and all those who loved her. And here she herself stood, having opened the door to a stable of marauding, ravening wolves who didn't want to be aware of any guilt. How much of this devilish DNA have I inherited, she asked herself, dumbfounded. How am I supposed to trust myself? Why should I be better than the person who just 1 year after starting work at the ERR was awarded the War Merit Cross II class by Rosenberg, albeit without a sword? Her dad was transferred to Paris. She fixed her gaze on the documents again. He lived in the 16th arrondissement of all places, where she had once been with Bruno, who had spent a year of his studies there. In Paris, her father had written this unspeakable report, which could be read on all websites, titled France, Economy, Semitic Infiltration, Supranational Powers, Collaboration with the Pétain Gouvernement, and Jewish Infiltration. In the opening of the very personal annual report, her dad talks about his encounter with one of the great French collaborators of the Nazi regime who, even though he was criticized by some Nazis, is praised by her dad as a great fighter for the Führer's goals. She stammered when she read Dad's words. Quote, there were sufficient hygienic elements in French society that could genetically regenerate these people both racially and extensively, provided that all Jews, all 175s, all Negroes, Gypsies, and other colored people were eliminated from this people by blood, and that this elimination was systematically carried out to the end. End of quote. In search of further information, she had gone to her parents' bedroom, or rather her mother's bedroom, pulled documents out of drawers, read them, sat slumped down, and read further. In horror, she had to take her eyes off the text, moved the bedside table a little, left the room, went outside around the corner to an Irish whiskey bar, ordered a double and took a big gulp, had another double whiskey brought in, downed it, and wished she had never lived. At some point, she rushed to the toilet, vomited her whiskey, and sat down on the toilet, completely exhausted. She was not surprised when a man suddenly stood in front of her. She had overlooked the fact that she had entered the wrong part. He bent down to her, took her in her arms, helped her up, and asked her if he could do anything for her, where she lived, and if he could call somebody to look after her. She was so distraught that not even the questions reached her ears. She was so exhausted. She was powerless, lifeless. She had no more memories. When she woke up, she was lying on a sofa with a light blanket over her. On the table next to her was a glass of warm tea and a small bottle of mineral water. And sitting on the chair opposite the sofa was a man she didn't know at all, who was sipping his glass of tea. "Oh dear," she said haltingly. "Where am I?" "All good," said the human voice. "All good." There was a long pause. Her eyes fell shut again, and she dreamed of the wagons full of people, covered in blood, trying to wrap themselves in the available linen they had separated from the picture frames of the degenerate artists, while the ice-cold air drew through the cracks in the wagons. She shook herself, feeling that she had left this world. With a blink, some light penetrated her. The man still seemed to be sitting in the same chair, in the same position, not wanting anything from her, not slaughtering people, not penetrating her, just sitting there. 77,000, she managed to say. "Do you know what 77,000 lives are?" The man looked at her calmly but helplessly, unable to understand what she was trying to tell him. That night, when he had picked her up in the men's room and had struggled to get her to his apartment in his car, he had thought she had too much to drink and just needed to sober up, but it dawned on him that it wasn't just the alcohol that had disturbed her so much. "What do you mean, 77,000? He asked the strange woman. Anika lifted her head for the first time, looked around, unsure, but then it dawned on her that she had had a terrible thread break the night before and was somewhere in a strange place. "Oh, so sorry," she said. "I don't know who you are, but I didn't mean to cause you any trouble. It was just the whiskey, maybe the second or third." "Shh," said her host. "You don't need to explain yourself. I'm off today anyway, and it's not every day that I have such an attractive woman lying on my sofa in the morning." He tried to relax the situation without seeming pushy. Anna had picked up on this tone correctly, and the first smile crossed her lips. I don't want to explain myself, it was just a terrible evening, the worst I've ever experienced. I just couldn't take it anymore, and it all has to do with the past." Her host dared to sit a little closer to her sofa, stroking her hair carefully and reservedly with his hand. "It must have taken a lot of you, what you experienced in the past." She shook her head, and a moment later she nodded. "It was so unbelievable," she said. "I don't know if I should tell you about it. We don't even know each other." "You don't have to, but if it makes you feel better, please. We can also go for a coffee together, or you can tell me where to take you and we can meet up again another day." Anika seemed to think the second option was the better one. She was so preoccupied with herself that she couldn't imagine starting a relationship with someone she didn't know, one that would begin with him lifting her out of the deepest abyss she had ever been in emotionally. Anika handed him Bruno's phone number and asked him to call Bruno. And Bruno picked her up. Thank you so much for listening to this second subchapter of chapter 3. Please, if you want, please subscribe to the channel and there will be more. Thank you.